Good afternoon. I'm still not quite at ease with this new technology. I mean, before I get to be familiar with the previous technology, now I'm supposed to start learning and working with a totally new technology. But the advantage, of course, missing actually meeting friends and being with friends is the primary liability. But there is also advantages to this, which enables me to do this without having to travel, which for me at this age is really a good thing. Now, allow me, please. I have a dry mouth sort of condition, so I need to sip water from time to time. Okay. Uh, I was trying to prepare for this conversation. I was reflecting on the previous 40 years of my life, maybe, probably. Since the 70s, at least, of the last century, until the present. And the idea for me actually has been that I should always be willing to test new ideas, not only by conversation, but actually by living experience and so on. So at this point, I think there was an aspect of my presentation that I just mentioned, we talked about with Ziba, which is the notion that what's the point of telling people what they already know or what they already accept? So the idea of challenging each other constantly is the least that we can do as intellectuals, as scholars, as teachers, in order to generate a new energy in the conversation. Because if our current conversation is not working, we have to think that the fault is with us, not with the audience. The question of Islam and human rights has always been tempting, but also, with all due respect, annoying. Because why Islam? There must be something about Islam that is seen as exceptional. I mean, because it is not all religions that are talked about in the same way. But for me, that question is not really what concerns me, because whatever I think about it, it's a personal challenge. I'm a Muslim from Sudan, and I remain a Muslim, and I refuse to compromise my identity in any way to serve any cause, even the so-called cause of human rights, because that cause really is suspect. And we have to really ask. I started my life, as I said, in the 70s as a scholar, a teacher, as a writer. And initially, it was primarily concerned with Sharia and human rights. So I took human rights for granted, and I was challenging Sharia in relation to that. Then I came to also to challenge the human rights side of the conversation. So now I have been working for the last 20 years or so on both fronts. Okay, so it is an understanding of Sharia and an understanding of human rights that may not agree with our expectations, but that is the whole point. One way of trying to explain is what I say, the three C's. That is the letter C 3 times. C as in concept, C as in content, and C as in context. Meaning that human rights, initially it has to be starting with the concept. Although the concept may not arise or remain static over time, but every conversation has to have that notion of concept somewhere in the picture, if not in the forefront of it. And the concept is universality. That is, if we are not talking about universal rights, we are not talking about human rights. There are all sorts of rights, and there have been rights for centuries, and there will be rights also for centuries to come if this life on this planet continues. But the point is that whatever it is universal. If it is not universal, then talk about something else. Talk about relativism of, and I do. To me, one of the emphases I'm developing is the question of the relativity of liberalism and how the charge of being relativist is universal in the sense that all traditions are faced with the same challenge. And I think that it is a post-colonial phenomenon that we have to defend. I mean people from the South, from the global South, have to defend our commitment to human rights because it is suspect by virtue of our religious affiliation. And that, of course, is counterproductive because if it comes to is it Islam or human rights, Islam will win. In my mind, there is absolutely no contest. But the point is that they are not, and they should not be put in those terms. The second C is the C of content, meaning what is the normative content of human rights. Granted that we have an idea back in 1948 that people were very excited about. By the way, those people are not, does not include me, does not include anything to do with my world. So the idea of universality had a very problematic birth because it was not inclusive at the beginning of the conversation. And subsequent members of the so-called international community were joining that something that was already pre-established, preconceived. It was not open for total transformation of thinking and attitude and conviction. So therefore, there is a challenge to the content in terms of its lack of universal relevance and conversation and participation and conviction and so on. Then the third one is context, which is where and how are human rights expected to be practiced on the ground in various places and so on. So those are the three C's that I hope will help us navigate the subject, at least for raising enough issues that we can discuss today. The question, therefore, is part of here I come to speak about something totally probably new to some of us, that at this point in my life, and you wonder when is this guy going to be more moderate or open to compromise. I'm taking on the challenge of the very idea of Sharia. I'm claiming that this is a totally post-colonial discourse that in fact is already defeating whatever it is that we seek by the very idea of it. The idea of normative central or normative anchor, that there is something that is called Sharia that was there from the beginning, that Muslims lived by all these centuries, and now it is time to shift it into the post-colonial nation-state context. I challenge this. I argue that actually the term Sharia and the notion of Sharia is misleading, and in fact it has been generated by a post-colonial need for a colonial organization of the state and of legal systems and of social life. So it was not something that came about historically through Muslim experiences, but something that was invented in the colonial and post-colonial discourse of our communities. And therefore, one may wonder what we will think about Islam and human rights if we take Sharia out of it. So it is not Islam, Sharia, and human rights, but Islam and human rights as a religion, as a culture, as a normative and ethical system. the point I just mentioned about how the conversation started somewhat tilted and not quite fair and inclusive is what I call the confidence trick of the 20th century. The idea of confidence trick, I don't know, I tried to look for a more elegant way of saying it, but all I can say is that the confidence trick is someone who abused your confidence by giving you what you had not bargained for, but somehow covers it up in a way that you can't say no, and it's not really quite what you had expected to receive. So I think the concept is clear. I mean, about this confidence trick. Now, my charge is that colonial states and post-colonial states have really presented their distinctive indigenous formations of rights, liberal conceptions of rights, and presented them as universal. So that in 1948, it is not that we started by saying, okay, let us see and let us go on and try to reach. And of course, there was an effort. I mean, the famous UNESCO conference or rather survey about global intellectual trends and so on, about trying to understand what universality means. But that was a really very minor exception to the dominance of the state-centric push for having Western liberal ideas as the primary formation and focus of the notion of human rights. And I think that it's a confidence trick that is no longer tenable. And for a long time, I personally was part of that trick. I mean, I was somewhat taken by it and was one of its actors, one of its advocates. I'm not saying that there should be no human rights, but in fact, I'm saying that the rights must be human. And the question, therefore, is in what ways and how can we be talking about universal human rights when we have such very powerful anchor of the nation state and even regional organizations like the European Union and its commitment to liberal values. So that open up the conversation if you want to be taken seriously. But if you are going to say human rights are universal and they just so happen to be my conception of human rights, that will not go anywhere. There is also this notion of what I call the hypocrisy. Because confidence, if it's a confidence trick, the confidence, at least that part, have to be real. But if there is no confidence, then there is no possibility of taking this further. The confidence trick, I mean that, the idea that the hypocrisy of it is that when major powers like the United States, and in a book I am publishing these days, I'm working on it, it's close, it will come out by July, and it's called Decolonizing Human Rights. And the idea is that part of the colonial vision is, of course, the reality that the United States is the ultimate, I call it the supreme hypocrisy of the United States, is the ultimate champion, so-called, of human rights, while it is not willing to do anything about it at home. So if you are not willing to accept the idea as it impacts your own legal system, your own cultural values, why and how can you ask anybody else to comply? I think this is the most striking idea or the fallacy of that you are committed to universality. You are not. You are committed to a propaganda that presents yourself as the global champion of human rights without any commitment to those values on your own and in your own system and life and so on. So this is the one aspect of the challenge. The second aspect is also on the European side. And I think that the challenge to Europe has come through the refugees crisis. It's ironic that refugees are probably the ultimate subject of human rights because human rights are supposed to be universal, meaning that they are the rights of the human by virtue of being human, and that's all what refugees have. They don't have any military power or material power or social power that they can use. It's just simply the reality or the fact that they are human beings. So if we are committed to universality, we have to be committed to universality as it applies to refugees primarily and particularly. And there is not, it is not a problem that we will not have enough subjects. There are millions and millions of refugees around the world. But when those refugees come to our door demanding at least serious consideration of their application to asylum, they are locked up somewhere at the convenience of the state. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. And only about 2 hours drive south of Atlanta is one of the major prisons where asylum seekers are kept for years at the discretion and at the will of the state of the United States. It's not willing to adjudicate. Of course, the regime that protects the rights of refugees suffers from the very powerful reality that you cannot really quite live up to the challenge. But you can do that by trying to screen asylum seekers and accept some and reject some, but you can't take them all and so on. You know that, of course, it's obvious. Well, what I'm saying is that when Europe was faced with that challenge over the last 2-3 years, of course, the pandemic now has created a new reality, but for years before that, and still I think going on, although it is less visible, is the fact that huge numbers of people are fleeing wars in the Middle East and North Africa, in which European powers and the European Union and NATO has played a very crucial role. We should not forget how sort of the situation in Libya was created due to the bombing and military intervention by NATO, which was not willing to follow through into taking the whole situation into a more humane, civilized level that it claims to have come to implement. So I know that I will soon, if not already, coming out of time. So let me come to some sort of conclusion by pulling these threads. To begin with, I think that the idea of human rights is, as Mahatma Gandhi is reported to have said, it's a good idea. I think he said it in relation to, I think, civilization, and was asked about European civilization, and he said it sounds like a good idea. That's what I heard him reported as saying, and that's it. That it is a good idea, nobody can doubt. The fact that it is a challenging idea, it is an impossible idea, because it demands of every society, of every community, to be willing to accept and to treat fully as a human being anybody who needs that. I mean, anybody who comes or seeks asylum anywhere should be granted asylum without question, because the point is that it's not that you are tested at your humanity by virtue of your willingness to subscribe to certain political ideas or to be willing to commit to certain political values, but just simply by being human. Uh, and this idea, I mean, we have seen, I think, many of us, I'm sure that at the time they have experienced, being in Europe yourself, or some of us at least, uh, we would have seen this. It is a notion that we screen asylum seekers and we keep them in camps and we look the other way. I mean, the example of Australia is horrendous, where this it's almost like science fiction. When you have thousands and hundreds of thousands of people being locked in an island in the Pacific, offshore completely, and nobody knows what goes on in that island, except that we know people go into it and never come out. I mean, we haven't seen that sort of the process which was supposed to legitimize and justify that horrendous practice. And here it is that refugees are not really treated at the level of their humanity. And that is really the test. It is not where you can grant asylum to promote your political objectives. To show that you have the superior system and so on, you are granted asylum. But in fact, it is through the human rights treaties, so-called, that we are supposed to have a universal conviction and commitment to the humanity of the human. But in practice, that is not true. It's not practiced. It's not lived by. The United States, as I said, is the supreme hypocrisy because the United States, to begin with, refused to ratify human rights treaties. Very rarely would they step forward to say, they participate in the drafting of treaties. And they do everything they can to dilute and water down the quality of the treaties and the level of protection the treaties provide, but only to say at the end, okay, now you can go and do this, I'm not part of it. So they don't ratify. And the 3-4 treaties that they ratified, like the Torture Convention, for example, is so restricted by qualifications and what's so-called reservations that it's totally emptied of its normative content. And explicitly, the language of the reservations says that we will not adopt any change in our legal system or process by virtue of our membership of this treaty. Openly. And they say this for torture, they say this for all types of treaties in the human rights field. And in any case, treaties are not really very helpful because they are about rights among the states, obligations among the states. So the ultimate subject of human rights, the human person, has no standing, has no position to challenge what the states are doing or failing to do. There is no institutional position or facility where people can go and challenge their own states or other states. It is very traditional international law of state obligations among states for states. And therefore, I think that there are fundamental, what I would say, problems with the idea of universality, of the idea of the human by virtue of their humanity and so on. Where do I go from here? I go immediately to the same purpose that I thought I was pursuing all my life, which is to say that human rights is a measure of my humanity. And I commit to them by virtue of my own conviction, regardless. So I'm not looking to see whether anybody else is joining me. I'm saying that for myself, in my own environment and context, here is my moral position. Here is my political position. the legal is really not very useful. So the idea is about, I'm sorry, okay. I hope it will stop. Okay. So anyway, it's time for me to stop anyway, to say that it has to be that. It has to be my conviction regarding my religious obligation, my cultural and political identity, and to go forward with that. So I will defend these values because I believe them to be valid and believe them to be imperative for the humanity of the human. And I do so regardless, in fact, despite the current global system of treaty networks that are supposed to promote these rights, but only in conferences and annual reviews and so on, but not in everyday life for the truly human uh, value of honoring each other. So that will be, I think, my conversation or my contribution so far, and I hope that we can, or it will become clearer, hopefully, from those who understood what I'm trying to say and can give us their reflections on it. Thank you very much.